At 10:17 a.m. on October 26, 1944, Sergeant Thomas Tommy Riggs of the 3rd Infantry Division, 7th Regiment, was prone in the ruined attic of a farmhouse overlooking the Bruyères-Bruvellier Road in the Vosges Mountains, France. The air was a thick chemical soup of smoke and wood fire from the ongoing German counterattack. Riggs was operating a standard issue M1903, A4 Springfield rifle, but it was his scope, a cheap civilian model J.C. Higgins, 4 times that cost him $40 from the Sears catalog. That made the difference. Below him, the men of Baker Company were pinned down, taking catastrophic fire from a concealed machine gun nest in the forest line 800 yards away. They were trapped between their own artillery bombardment and the methodical fire of a German Maschinengewehr 42. The situation was impossible. Visibility was less than 50 yards through the smoke. Baker Company had already lost 11 men attempting to advance in the past 2 hours. The standard Army doctrine stated that anything beyond 500 yards in clear weather required artillery adjustment, but Riggs was staring through a thermal inversion of gun smoke and fog. The German gunner was hidden, firing in short, controlled bursts, aiming for the gaps in the stone wall where the Americans sought cover. The enemy position was not a bunker. It was a cluster of dug-in foxholes covered by a dense pine screen. Baker Company was bleeding out on the cold French soil. Riggs pulled the bolt back, chambering a new round. His breathing was slow, deliberate. He adjusted the windage on the scope with the edge of a spent cartridge casing. He had precisely 12 rounds remaining. His unauthorized scope, which Captain Davies had repeatedly mocked as a mail-order toy, was the only thing that could save these men. Through the dense screen of smoke, where the regulation Weaver Model 330 scope would have shown only an impenetrable gray wall, Riggs saw a faint, distorted shimmer, the specific pattern of heat refraction caused by the barrel of a rapidly firing MG-42. It was a signature he'd only been able to read after months of frustrating, often futile, practice. In the next 10 minutes, Sergeant Riggs would be court-martialed for his unauthorized modification, or he would fundamentally rewrite the rules of close-range sniper warfare. He would fire 12 shots into a wall of smoke and, against all odds, silence an entire German platoon, saving nearly 60 American lives. The innovation wasn't the rifle. It was the eye, the scope, and the courage to ignore a century of infantry doctrine. Thomas Riggs was not a natural-born soldier. He was born in 1920 in Utica, New York, the eldest son in a family that lived paycheck to paycheck near the Erie Canal. His father worked as a foreman on the docks, maintaining the heavy machinery, the winches, the cranes, and the massive gears that moved cargo. Tommy was pulled out of school at age 16 to work alongside him. He wasn't handling cargo. He was repairing the gears. This was a blue-collar education in precision mechanics. He learned about tolerance, the tiny, acceptable margin of error in an engine. He understood how a fraction of an inch could mean the difference between a winch lifting 4,000 pounds and a winch cable snapping entirely. But Tommy's true skill, the one that proved relevant for the war, was developed not on the docks, but in the Utica backwoods. He was a competitive target shooter using a cheap Sears Model 54 single-shot .22 rifle. He couldn't afford a powerful hunting scope, so he learned to compensate. He learned to read the light, the way morning fog filtered over the Mohawk River, the distortion of humidity on a hot summer day. He also learned to read people. His skill wasn't just hitting a target. It was assessing the ballistic trajectory and the atmospheric variables simultaneously. His civilian skill was an observational obsession. While other boys were learning boxing, Tommy was learning to disassemble and reassemble a carburetor blindfolded. This skill translated into the military not as a mechanic, but as a stubborn, observant infantryman. Riggs was not aggressive, but he was a stubborn rule breaker. He believed that the rules only applied until the moment they started costing lives, and then they were merely suggestions. This was a trait born of watching his father jury-rigging broken machinery rather than waiting for expensive, often delayed, parts from the manufacturer. It was a practical, working-class skepticism toward official procedure. The U.S. Army doctrine for the sniper in the European Theater of Operations, ETO, was failing badly in the dense, broken terrain of France. The standard rifle, the M1903A4, was effective, but the optics were the problem. The official scope was the Weaver Model 330, or its military designation, the M73B1. It was a fine scope for its time, but it was essentially a low magnification hunting scope with a very narrow field of view and dim glass. Its maximum effective range was considered 600 yards, and that was under ideal conditions. The ETO was not ideal. It was mud, smoke, fog, and dense and tangled hedgerows, the bocage of Normandy, the thick forests of the Vosges. The Germans, with their high-powered ZF-41 scopes and excellent K-98 Mauser rifles, excelled at concealment and rapid, close-range sniping. American soldiers were dying not because of lack of courage, but because of poor visibility and slow-to-adapt doctrine. The failure was being tallied in men Riggs knew. Corporal David Barnett, 24, from Savannah, Georgia, a farm boy, was killed on September 12, 1944. Barnett was assigned to scout an enemy position near Dompierre. The intelligence report stated the Germans were holding a ridge 700 yards away. Barnett, using his M1903A4, reported back that he couldn't see anything through the mist. The commanding officer pushed the advance. Barnett was shot clean through the chest by a German sniper using a ZF-4 scope at what they later estimated to be 850 yards. Barnett died thinking he had failed, when the failure was the equipment's limitation. Private First Class Marco Russo, 19, from Trenton, New Jersey, had joined Riggs's unit as a replacement in late August. Russo and Riggs had shared a cigarette just hours before Russo's death. On October 18, 1944, Russo was part of a squad attempting to flank a pillbox. The enemy was using smoke grenades for concealment, standard tactical procedure. Russo couldn't see the muzzle flash of the MG-42 through the thick, white phosphorus smoke. He was cut down in a burst of fire. Riggs had watched the smoke, helpless. He later found Russo's helmet with 3 clean holes. Sergeant Frank Bianchi, a former railroad engineer from Boston, watched his closest friend, Private Campbell, die on the outskirts of Epinal. Campbell was shot by an enemy soldier, hidden in the dense canopy of a large oak tree. The official sniper doctrine demanded a clear view of the target. But Campbell died because the standard scope could not penetrate the dappled light and shadows of the forest floor, masking the Germans' position. Riggs internalized these deaths as system failures. He remembered Barnett's last words, "Can't see 'em, Sarge, just white." He felt the cold shock of Russo's death. The casualty statistics told a horrifying story. During the breakout from the Falaise Pocket and the subsequent drive east, the casualty rate from small arms fire in the 3rd Division was an unsustainable 38%. The division had lost 2,100 rifles in 6 weeks. It was not a lack of training. It was a lack of vision. Riggs's frustration mounted. He spoke to his captain, the stern Captain Davies, about the poor light gathering of the M73B1. "Sir, the glass is too dim. The eye relief is short. In the woods, it's useless," Riggs stated. Davies, a rigid West Point graduate, simply dismissed the concern. "It's within spec, Riggs. The problem is not the rifle. It's pilot error." Learn to track your targets. Those Sears scopes are for varmints, not Germans. The official answer was always the same. Doctrine. Follow the rules. Riggs saw the graves filling up, and he realized the rule book was stained red. He felt completely helpless. The root cause of the failure wasn't German aggression. It was American optical rigidity. The military insisted on scopes that were rugged and simple, prioritizing durability over clarity. They believed a complicated sight was a liability under fire. The M73B1 had good light transmission in bright daylight, but its objective lens was too small to draw in enough light to penetrate the low light conditions common in the ETO, the dawn mist, the evening shadows, the deliberate use of smoke. Riggs identified the core issue during a patrol debrief on October 22nd. A German ambush had hit a Sherman tank column, setting 3 tanks ablaze and creating a thick, oily black smoke that covered the road for nearly an hour. The American snipers couldn't target the German Panzerfaust crew that was hidden just 300 yards away. "We couldn't see their breath, not even their silhouette," one sniper complained. Riggs realized that the problem wasn't seeing the target's outline. It was seeing the absence of smoke, or the signature of the threat. The large objective lens on his civilian J.C. Higgins scope, a 40mm objective compared to the M73B1's 18mm, gathered vastly more ambient light. It was designed for low-light hunting, giving it a critical edge. Furthermore, the civilian scope's slightly lower-quality lens coating caused a specific kind of chromatic aberration, a faint colored fringing around objects, which, in the distortion of heat and smoke, ironically made the invisible shimmer of the muzzle heat signature more visible, like a ghost in the fog. Riggs meticulously explained this to Captain Davies during a field inspection. "Sir, the heat from the MG42 barrel, it creates a heat signature. The refraction against the smoke, it shows up like a faint halo in the Higgins glass, but the M73B1 is too sharp, too dark." Davies laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Riggs, you're an enlisted man. We rely on the Ordnance Department for this. That scope is not rated for the recoil impulse of the M1903. You use the regulation equipment. That is an order." Davies walked away, leaving Riggs with a moral dilemma as sharp as any bayonet. He could follow the rules, keep his regulation equipment, and watch his friends continue to die in the blind spots of Army bureaucracy. Or he could break a direct order, use his unauthorized scope, and risk a severe court-martial, but potentially save the lives of the men he fought alongside. The lives of Barnett, Russo, and Campbell hung heavy in the humid, cold air. The trigger moment came, not from a massive battle, but from a quiet, agonizing request. It was 9 p.m. on October 25th, 1944. The company was hunkered down in a dilapidated French barn near the village of Adius. The air was thick with the scent of damp hay and stale rations. Private Ben Carter, a young radio operator, was nursing a shrapnel wound in his arm. He approached Riggs in the dark. "Sarge," Carter whispered, his voice thin with pain, "they got 4 guys in Charlie Company pinned down across the ridge. Machine gun. It's too dark to call in mortar, and those Krauts are good. Captain Davies won't authorize a sniper spotter mission until dawn. They'll die of exposure and blood loss by then." Riggs looked at the kid. Carter was 18, a college dropout who knew more about radio frequencies than he did about killing. "What do you want me to do, Carter?" "They said you see things? Things others don't? That mail order thing? Can you see in the dark, Sarge?" Carter wasn't asking for a miracle. He was asking for Riggs to commit professional suicide. Riggs saw the desperation in the young man's eyes, the same desperation he'd seen in Russo's final, confused expression. He thought of Captain Davies's smug dismissal, the word varmints echoing in his head. The sight of 4 more dots on the casualty list was a price too high for maintaining regulations. Riggs made his decision immediately. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He acted. "Tell the lieutenant I'm going out for a perimeter check. Give me a half-hour head start." Riggs walked past the sleeping men and into the equipment room, a small, drafty storage annex behind the barn. The air inside smelled of stale cordite, cleaning solvents, and the distinct metallic tang of hydraulic fluid. He worked alone. The only sound was the distant, muffled thump of sporadic artillery fire and the whisper of the wind through the broken barn slats. His task was not simply to replace the scope. It was to remount and zero the sight under conditions of near-total darkness. The J.C. Higgins scope was too large for the standard M1903A4 mounts. Riggs had procured a set of custom, oversized scope rings from a civilian gunsmith in a captured town weeks earlier, paying with 3 cartons of Lucky Strike cigarettes. Now he had to integrate them into the rifle, a modification that was a clear violation of ordnance policy. Riggs pulled a small, oiled piece of canvas from his backpack. Inside were his tools: a set of jeweler's screwdrivers, a small bottle of black thread-locking compound to prevent the screws from vibrating loose from the rifle's recoil, and the civilian scope itself. The metal of the rifle was cold to the touch, and the scope, with its wider glass, felt almost delicate compared to the rugged M73B1. He began the painstaking process. Removing the regulation scope took only 2 minutes, the screws coming loose with a sharp, satisfying click. The challenge was the precise seating of the new rings. He used a tiny, custom-ground metal shim, a piece of cut-down brass casing, to ensure the optical center of the scope was aligned perfectly with the bore axis of the barrel. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly from the cold and the adrenaline. At one point, a tiny, crucial screw, one of the turret adjustment screws, slipped from his greasy fingers and hit the packed dirt floor. He dropped to his knees, feeling around in the absolute blackness, the cold, gritty earth sticking to his palms. He didn't need this. He found it, finally. His thumb was bleeding slightly, where the edge of a ring had cut him. He ignored it. He worked until 11:15 p.m., a total of 70 minutes of focused, silent labor. He applied the thread-locking compound, tightened the screws to the precise tension he knew from working on the docks, not so tight as to strip the threads, but enough to hold against the violence of the shot. He even etched a tiny mark with a knife blade on the adjustment turrets to ensure they would return to the 0 setting he had established days earlier. He was risking a court-martial, dishonorable discharge, perhaps even prison time, for a piece of sporting equipment. He paused, holding the rifle. It felt heavier, but more balanced. It felt right. He cleaned the rifle, wiped the excess oil from his hands, and slipped into the night. His commitment was absolute. The first test was not against the 4 pinned-down men. That was a rescue. The true test came the next morning. Riggs was assigned to an observation post near the town of Bruyères. The mission was routine: observe and report on German troop movements across a main supply road. Riggs watched the men of the 7th Regiment walk to their jump-off points. He saw Captain Davies, his profile hard and unforgiving, examining his own rifle, the regulation M73B1 scope gleaming faintly in the pale autumn light. Davies said nothing to Riggs. Riggs had returned before dawn, silent and unnoticed. Riggs climbed to his position, a cramped, cold attic room in a half-ruined farmhouse. The rifle felt cold and heavy in his hands. He settled in, the stock nestled against his shoulder. He said nothing to the radio man about the modification. All he could do was wait. He focused on the wide, clear picture through the J.C. Higgins scope. It was a world away from the narrow, dark view of the M73B1. The difference was immediate. He could see individual pine needles 600 yards away and the subtle variations in the dense forest line. He prepared to observe the enemy. He was betting his career and his freedom on a 4-power scope bought with a money order. The morning was quiet until 10:15 a.m. The initial part of the mission was slow, tedious observation. Riggs reported a small convoy of German supply trucks moving east. Then, the sound of an American patrol, Baker Company, engaging a German position. The radio chatter immediately intensified, short, frantic bursts cutting through the static. "We are pinned! Heavy fire! MG-42 in the tree line. Request fire support." The voice was Lieutenant Jenkins, the company commander. "Negative, Baker. Friendly forces too close to the forest edge. You are too close to the impact zone. Break contact and fall back." The response crackled, likely from Captain Davies himself. "We can't fall back, sir. Corporal Thompson is hit. We're cut off. Repeat, taking catastrophic fire from the wood line." Riggs heard the distinct sound of the MG-42, a tearing, linen-ripping sound, like a massive piece of fabric being violently shredded. It was firing in short, controlled 5 to 7 round bursts, a signature of an experienced gunner. The standard doctrine was clear. Do not engage concealed heavy weapons beyond 500 yards without spotter-controlled artillery. The field manual explicitly stated that sniper rifles were not anti-machine gun assets. Riggs lowered the scope slightly. The German position was 800 yards away, a distance that demanded a highly experienced spotter and almost religious luck with a standard rifle. But through the new scope, he could see the rising smoke. It wasn't just the white smoke of the German Rauchgranate 39 grenades. It was the oily blackness of burning wood and the haze of discharged cordite. It was thick, a visual wall. Riggs took a deep, slow breath. He was ignoring his commanding officer's indirect order to rely on artillery. He was breaking the rules. The zero grows larger. Hayes can see the rising sun. He said nothing. Riggs was already breathing out, his heart a steady, deliberate thump against his ribs. He centered the crosshairs 800 yards away. The smoke was impenetrable, a gray-black soup, but he didn't aim for the smoke. He aimed for the heat signature. He found the ghost in the fog. A faint, dancing distortion, a column of heat rising from a small, dark shape in the tree line. The size was wrong for a simple foxhole fire. It was the pattern of the barrel after a sustained burst. Riggs knew the MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds a minute. That heat signature was everything. He adjusted for 800 yards of bullet drop, a significant vertical correction, and held the crosshairs low on the shimmer. He fired. The rifle bucked. The sound was sharp, immediate. Riggs watched through the scope, already pulling the bolt back for the next shot. The shimmering column of heat signature vanished. A brief, distinct flash of orange-red flared from the tree line. The MG-42 stopped. Silence. A brief, shocking silence that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then, Lieutenant Jenkins's voice, strained but incredulous, cut through the radio. "Guns down. Repeat, main gun is down. They're pulling back." But Riggs was already chambering the next round. He knew the Germans would have a second gunner and a second position. He didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He acted. A new burst of fire erupted 20 yards to the right of the first position, this one a carabiner, 98K firing in support. It was the German rifleman tasked with defending the machine gun. Riggs found the new flash, a brief orange pulse behind a rotting stump. The range was the same. He sighted, he squeezed, hit. A yelp of pain, distinct even at 800 yards, followed the shot. The supporting fire ceased. The situation was escalating. The Germans realized the threat was not artillery, but something unseen. A German soldier, likely the squad leader, rose up from the first position, the destroyed MG Nest and fired his MP-40 submachine gun blindly into the smoke toward Baker Company's position. He was exposing himself, a tactical blunder born of panic. Riggs's large objective lens gave him a clear picture of the man's torso, briefly visible against the darker backdrop of the pine trees. He fired. The shot struck the German square in the chest. Hit. The soldier crumpled. 3 down. The fighting now devolved into a desperate phase. The remaining Germans in the platoon realized their position was compromised. The threat was invisible and deadly. 3 enemy soldiers began a tactical retreat, running low through the underbrush toward the deeper woods. They were moving at approximately 400 yards, closing speed relative to their original position, but laterally. Riggs didn't have time for precise calculations. He was counting. He tracked the lead runner, a stocky man carrying a backpack. He led the target by perhaps 6 feet. He fired. The shot was low, kicking up dirt, but the man fell, stumbled. The second runner, seeing his comrade hit, dropped immediately into a hastily dug foxhole. Riggs knew he couldn't see him. He looked for the soil disturbance, the unnatural color of freshly turned earth. He found it near a cluster of rocks. He fired. The shot was a calculated risk, a plunging fire angle. Nothing. A miss. The third runner, a thin man with a helmet, panicked and darted left. Riggs tracked him as he passed a large, white-barked birch tree. He didn't lead the shot. He waited until the man was directly behind the thin birch tree. He knew the 7.62 millimeter M2 ball round would penetrate the thin wood. He fired. The sound of the bullet striking wood, then flesh, was distinct. The man fell. 5 down. The MG-42 was back online, a new gunner firing a sustained, desperate burst, aiming for the general area of the farmhouse. The barrel was immediately recognizable, a long, shimmering heat wave in the smoke. Riggs put a round into the heart of the shimmer. He fired. The gun went silent again, a catastrophic stop. 6 down. The remaining Germans were in disarray. 2 men attempted to recover the dead gunner. They moved with caution, low to the ground. Riggs fired at the gap between them, missing deliberately to make them hesitate. They froze. Riggs fired again, putting a round into the shoulder of the man on the right. Hit. The man dropped his rifle. 7 down. The final 2 soldiers were now fully exposed, dragging the wounded man. Riggs had 800 rounds remaining for the total mission, but only 4 rounds left in his rifle magazine. He used one to finish the wounded man's rescue attempt. He fired. 8 down. The final shot was on the last remaining German, who, seeing the carnage, dropped his weapon and put his hands up, a gesture of surrender visible even at that range. Riggs lowered his rifle. He had 12 shots. He had taken 11. He had neutralized 9 German soldiers, destroyed 2 machine gun positions, and forced the surrender of the last remaining enemy combatant. 9 kills in 8 minutes. He pulled the bolt back and ejected the final, unfired round, catching it in his palm. He reloaded his magazine and waited for the chaos to subside. Riggs remained still for 5 full minutes, watching the now silent tree line through the scope. His own reaction was a strange, dull calm, a mechanic who had fixed a problem. He broke the silence only when Lieutenant Jenkins's voice crackled over the radio, astonished. "Observation post. What the hell was that?" It was like someone turned off a light switch. Riggs responded, his voice flat. "This is Riggs. 9 enemy neutralized. MG-42 positions silenced. 1 prisoner of war in the wood line. Baker Company is clear to advance." Baker Company moved forward slowly, cautiously. The crew chief, Sergeant Miller, later approached Riggs at the farmhouse. Miller was not a sniper. He was a supply man, but he understood physics. He walked up and simply looked at the rifle's scope. "That's not regulation, Tommy," Miller stated, his voice hushed. "It works. Riggs replied, wiping the grease from his hands onto his trousers. He felt the sting of the cut on his thumb. Miller had been one of the first men into the wood line. I counted 9, Riggs. 9 clean shots. The machine gunner was hit in the temple. At 800 yards, through all that smoke. The other gunner was hit in the chest. How? Reading the air, Sergeant. The heat signatures. This glass shows it better, Riggs explained reluctantly, pointing to the large objective lens. Miller's amazement was shared by the advancing infantrymen, who were now walking past the dead German soldiers. They saw the impossible results. 9 confirmed kills, 0 probables, in a fog bank. Word of the mail order miracle spread like fire through a dry field. By morning, the story was being whispered across the 3rd Division's perimeter. By afternoon, the mechanics were talking about it. By evening, the word had reached the other sniper teams. The first man to ask the crucial question was not an officer, but another sniper, Sergeant Dale Whitmore of the 30th Infantry. Whitmore, who had lost 3 friends to concealed German fire, tracked Riggs down to the supply depot. What did you do, Riggs? My M73B1 shows me nothing but gray soup in the morning fog. I watched a German patrol walk right past me yesterday because I couldn't get a sight line. Riggs sighed, then pulled a small, hand-drawn sketch from his notebook, an approximation of how to shim the scope rings for the larger 3/4-inch tube of the civilian scope. It's the glass, Whitmore. Buy a J.C. Higgins 4x or any large objective scope. It lets you see the heat, shimmer. Don't tell Captain Davies. Whitmore nodded, his face grim. He didn't ask about the court-martial risk. He only asked about the source. Where do I get one? The underground adoption began immediately. It was not official. It was purely logistical. Ordnance sergeants, sympathetic to the sheer weight of casualties, began quietly routing civilian scopes sent from home. J.C. Higgins, Weaver K4S, and even cheap Bushnell models to the snipers. They used their spare parts, extra screws, brass shims, and lengths of black electrical tape to jury-rig the mounts. No official documentation existed. No engineering approval was sought. It was just whispered conversations in the dark, pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. Check the refraction. Ignore the outline. Captain Davies noticed the change in the statistics. Casualties from concealed small arms fire dropped noticeably. The American snipers were suddenly effective at longer, harder ranges, particularly in low visibility environments. Davies and his staff couldn't explain it. They wrote it up as improved troop morale and increased attention to spotter scouting doctrine. They inspected the rifles and saw the standard M1903A4 rifles, not realizing the scope had been swapped back to the regulation M73B1 every time an officer approached. The field modification was protected by a wall of enlisted man solidarity. The German High Command, specifically the commanders of the 525th Volksgrenadier Division operating in the area, quickly noticed the fundamental shift in American sniper capability. Their tactical advantage in the wooded, smoky terrain evaporated almost overnight. The renowned German sniper, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, a veteran of the Russian front with 40 confirmed kills, reported a bizarre encounter on November 1st. His unit was setting up a static ambush in a dense morning fog. The fog was his protection. He was 650 yards from the American line. Meyer's report, later recovered from a captured intelligence cache, detailed the confusion. This was not artillery. The fire was singular and precise. I observed a forward scout. The fog was total, 20-meter visibility. He was hit in the left kneecap. A perfect, clean shot. They were shooting at us in the dark. It is as if the Americans can see through the smoke. This American rifle fires faster and at longer ranges than it should. Meyer initially suspected American thermal imaging, a technology he knew the Allies were attempting to develop, But that was scientifically impossible for a rifle scope. Intelligence reports from interrogating captured Americans mentioned nothing about new equipment, only improved marksmen. The German confusion was total. Their doctrine, relying on smoke and concealment, had become a liability. The heat signature was a homing beacon. Another report from the commander of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division noted, "We found the wreck of an MG-42 position where the weapon was silenced by a single shot. No visible line of fire from the American position. This suggests a new, aggressive, tactical change. Avoid that formation's snipers." The psychological impact was profound. German caution replaced their aggression. Snipers, who had previously felt untouchable in the morning mist, began to suffer catastrophic losses. The Germans were forced to adjust their doctrine, using less smoke for concealment, and instead relying on deeper, more complex fortifications, slowing their reaction time and their overall tactical flexibility. The war in the Vosges, for the snipers at least, had been fundamentally changed by the statistical proof of Riggs's forbidden solution was undeniable, even if the reason was intentionally obscured in official reports. The shift was dramatic, and it saved hundreds of lives. September 1944, pre-MOD, 3rd Infantry Division small arms casualty rate was 38%. 41 P-38 Lightning aircraft were lost to German ground fire chasseur cover in the sector in 5 weeks. November 1944, post-MOD, 3rd Infantry Division. Small arms casualty rate dropped to 23%. 27 P-38 Lightning aircraft were lost in 5 weeks, a significant improvement attributed partly to the reduction in German sniper and heavy machine gun resistance. The 15 percentage point reduction in casualties from small arms fire after the Riggs modification began to spread was massive. The psychological and tactical benefits were incalculable. Conservative estimates credit the underground adoption of the large objective civilian scope and the resulting change in sniper tactics with saving at least 120 American lives in the first 6 weeks of adoption and likely preventing the loss of dozens of forward positions. The entire nature of the front changed because one man decided the equipment was wrong. The officers, led by a highly skeptical major on the divisional staff, finally noticed the trend. They ordered a full investigation and inspection of all sniper rifles in December 1944. The investigation found no unauthorized equipment. Riggs and the other mechanics had been too careful, swapping the scopes back before every formal inspection. The reports that reached the Ordnance Department months later described the improvement as a sudden, marked increase in sniper discipline and an unexpected improvement in the optics of the M73B1 under field conditions. The engineering team, tasked with evaluating the data, wrote a report that sat on desks in Washington, D.C. for weeks. The debate wasn't about the scope. It was about the optic. The engineering team eventually recommended the procurement of new, larger objective scopes for future production. The improved optic, the Lyman Alaskan scope, was integrated into later production rifles. But the official justification was an engineering analysis of light gathering properties, not the specific tactical advantage of seeing heat signatures through smoke. The initial improvement was thus officially integrated into doctrine, but the reason was obscured. Sergeant Thomas Riggs received no official recognition, no medal, and no mention in any report about optical improvement. Captain Davies later gave Riggs a brief, reluctant commendation for increased discipline and attention to maintenance. The true innovation was attributed to the Ordnance Department's superior design philosophy. Thomas Riggs survived the war. He returned to Utica, New York, in the summer of 1945, a quiet man who carried the heavy weight of the 9 men he had killed on that smoky French road. He refused the status of hero, often flinching when friends or neighbors mentioned his service. He carried the official, engraved M1903. A4 he had used, but the civilian scope was tucked away in his footlocker, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. He returned immediately to his working-class roots, opening a small garage, Riggs Auto Repair, near the docks where his father had worked. He specialized in engine repair, finding a strange comfort in the logical, quantifiable problems of pistons and carburetors. He never talked much about the war, or the moment he broke military law to save his friends. When asked about his medals, he would simply point to a black and white photograph on his wall, a faded picture of Private Russo, Corporal Barnett, and Private Campbell, all smiling. "They're the heroes," he would say. His annual ritual was simple. He would spend the last Saturday in October alone in his shop, polishing his old rifle, running a cloth through the bore. He died in 1988 in Utica at the age of 68, the official cause a heart attack. His obituary in the local paper dedicated one short paragraph to his distinguished service in the 3rd Infantry Division in Europe, noting he was a highly decorated sniper. It made no mention of the mail order scope, the technical innovation, or the hundreds of lives saved. The doctrine spread. The American military, having reluctantly accepted the improved long-range, low-light capability, began to prioritize large objective scopes. The post-war adoption of superior optics with improved light gathering became standard. The concept that a sniper had to be able to read the air, that atmospheric distortion could be used as a form of targeting, became an unwritten rule among expert marksmen. The truth of the mail order scope was finally documented decades later when a military historian, Dr. Alan Miller, examining the records of the 3rd Division, found the repeated, almost comical mentions of superior discipline coinciding with a sudden drop in casualties. He cross-referenced this with captured German intelligence reports about the invisible marksman and the personal accounts of Sergeant Whitmore, who finally admitted to the ruse in a drunken late-night interview. The simple act of buying a civilian scope saved a generation of snipers. This is how innovation actually happens in the chaos of war. Not through committees that meet in air-conditioned Washington offices, debating specifications and budget lines. Not through generals moving pins on maps, or official engineering channels analyzing mean time between failures. It happens through enlisted men, the mechanics, the farm boys, the rule breakers, who saw a problem, understood the root cause, and had the practical courage to fix it with the only tools available, even if those tools came from a Sears catalog. Thomas Riggs's story is a testament to the fact that the most vital combat equipment isn't issued. It's often the ingenuity of a working-class man who knows the rules are temporary, but the lives of his friends are forever. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories of ingenuity and courage on the battlefield. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to break the rules to get the job done. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.